The sky was torn by lightning, and the rain poured down in sheets as if it would never stop. Amara, a little black girl, trudged through the puddles, eager to get home. But a sudden whimper made her pause. She turned her head and saw a tiny puppy trembling under a trash bin. Its eyes were full of fear and desperation. Without a second thought, Amara scooped the puppy into her arms, holding it close to shield it from the rain. She had no idea that this small act of kindness would change her life forever. What do you think happened next? Share your ideas in the comments. And to find out how this story unfolds, make sure to subscribe to our channel and leave a like. The rain poured in torrents, hammering the rooftops and streets with a ferocity that made the narrow alleys of the neighborhood glisten like silver rivers under the occasional flash of lightning. Amara pulled her tattered hoodie tighter around her small frame, though it did little to keep her dry. Each step she took splashed through the rapidly forming puddles, the icy water soaking her worn sneakers. She knew she should have stayed at her friend's house until the storm passed, but the thought of her grandmother sitting alone in their little apartment pushed her forward. As she turned down an alley shortcut, her ears caught a faint, high-pitched whimper barely audible over the downpour. She stopped abruptly, her heart skipping a beat. The sound came again, desperate and weak, cutting through the storm like a cry for help. Amara scanned the dimly lit alley, her sharp eyes darting between the overflowing trash bins and the scattered debris. Then she saw it, a small, shivering form huddled under a rusted trash can lid propped against the wall. At first glance, it looked like a piece of trash, soaked and muddy, blending into the shadows. But as she stepped closer, the figure moved, and two large, pleading eyes met hers. It was a puppy, barely larger than a loaf of bread. Its fur, once fluffy and light, was now matted and soaked through, clinging to its frail body. It was trembling violently, its tiny ribs visible with each labored breath. The puppy let out another pitiful whimper as Amara knelt down, her heart aching at the sight. "Oh, you poor thing," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. She reached out her hand slowly, afraid the little creature might run, but it didn't move. Whether out of exhaustion or trust, it simply looked up at her, its eyes reflecting a mixture of fear and hope. Without hesitation, Amara slipped her arms around the puppy, cradling it against her chest. The warmth of its body, even in its fragile state, was enough to make her forget the cold rain soaking through her clothes. She pulled her hoodie over the puppy as best she could, shielding it from the relentless downpour. "You're safe now," she whispered, as if her words alone could protect it. As she stood, a crack of thunder rolled overhead, making the puppy flinch and bury its tiny head into the crook of her arm. Amara held it closer, her resolve strengthening. She didn't know where this puppy had come from or who it belonged to, but in that moment, she knew one thing for sure: she couldn't leave it behind. With renewed determination, Amara trudged forward through the storm, the puppy's faint breaths steadying against her heartbeat. Little did she know, the small life she had just saved would set into motion a chain of events that would challenge everything she thought she knew about the world, and herself. The grand estate at the edge of the city was eerily quiet, its sprawling gardens and majestic fountains obscured by the growing shadows of an impending storm. Inside the vast mansion, Thomas Hargrove sat alone in a plush leather chair by the window, his gaze fixed on the turbulent clouds rolling in. A man of wealth and influence, Thomas had everything one could desire: a fortune built on generations of success, an estate that whispered of old money, and connections that could open any door. Yet none of it mattered anymore. His world had unraveled the day he lost his wife and daughter in a tragic car accident a year earlier. The laughter that once filled the halls of his home was now a distant echo, replaced by an oppressive silence that grew heavier with each passing day. Loneliness had crept in, slowly and insidiously, until it was his constant companion. Then came the puppy. A month ago, on an otherwise mundane afternoon, Thomas had found himself wandering aimlessly through the city when he stumbled upon a litter of golden retriever puppies at an adoption event. Their soft, playful yips had drawn a faint smile to his lips, a rarity these days. Among them, one tiny pup stood out, nudging its way to him with unsteady legs and an eager wag of its tail. It was the first time in months that Thomas had felt something other than emptiness. He brought the puppy home that same day, naming him Max. Max quickly became the light in Thomas's dark world. The puppy's boundless energy and unconditional affection began to chip away at the fortress of grief surrounding his heart. They were inseparable, whether it was Max tumbling through the estate's vast gardens, curling up at Thomas's feet during long, sleepless nights, or playfully tugging at the hem of his tailored trousers. But now, as the storm raged outside, Max was gone. It had happened so quickly. Thomas had stopped at a convenience store during his drive back from the city to grab a bottle of water. He had left Max in the car, certain he'd only be gone a moment. But the sound of a barking dog outside had startled the puppy, and in a moment of excitement, Max had leapt out of the open window and dashed off into the streets. By the time Thomas realized what had happened, Max was nowhere to be seen. Panic surged through him, his chest tightening as though the air itself had been stolen. The streets were growing darker, and the first drops of rain began to fall, dotting the pavement like scattered tears. Max! Thomas shouted into the thickening storm, his voice cracking with desperation. He ran through the streets, his polished shoes slipping on the wet pavement, his umbrella discarded in frustration. The thought of Max alone and frightened in the storm was unbearable. The puppy had been his salvation, the one thing keeping him from slipping entirely into despair. He couldn't lose him, not now, not ever. He searched every alley, every corner, calling Max's name over and over. His expensive coat was soaked through, and the rain plastered his dark hair to his forehead, but he didn't care. Each passing moment without Max felt like a knife twisting deeper into his heart. "Please," he muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible over the roar of the rain. "Please, let me find him." Lightning split the sky, illuminating the city in a blinding flash. For a brief moment, Thomas thought he saw a small, golden shape darting into the shadows of an alleyway. He sprinted toward it, his heart pounding with hope and fear. But when he reached the spot, there was nothing, just the empty street and the unrelenting downpour. As the storm grew fiercer, Thomas felt his resolve waver. He was drenched, exhausted, and overwhelmed by a sinking sense of hopelessness. Yet, as he stood there in the rain, he clenched his fists and made a silent vow. He would find Max, no matter what it took. The puppy had brought him back from the edge of despair, and now it was his turn to do the same. Little did Thomas know, Max had already been found, by a girl with a heart as pure as the storm was wild. Amara burst through the apartment door, her clothes clinging to her skin, rainwater dripping from her hoodie onto the scuffed linoleum floor. She shivered as a gust of cold wind followed her inside, but her focus wasn't on herself. Tucked tightly against her chest was the trembling puppy, its small body radiating faint warmth against her soaked arms. "Grandma, I'm back," she called out, her voice shaking from the cold and excitement. In the cramped but cozy living room, her grandmother, Mrs. Etta, sat knitting in her favorite chair. The dim light of a single lamp illuminated her warm, wrinkled face, which now turned toward Amara with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Child, what on earth?" Mrs. Etta started, putting down her knitting and rising slowly. Her sharp eyes widened as she noticed the bundle in Amara's arms. "What's that you've got there?" "It's a puppy, Grandma. I found him in the alley, under a trash can. He was so cold and scared. I couldn't just leave him," Amara explained hurriedly, her voice tinged with both urgency and pride. Mrs. Etta sighed, her hands on her hips as she took in the sight of her granddaughter, drenched from head to toe, clutching the equally soaked puppy. "Amara, you've got a good heart, but you can't just be bringing strays home. Lord knows we barely got room for ourselves." Amara didn't respond immediately. Instead, she carefully set the puppy down on an old towel she'd grabbed from a shelf near the door. The little dog whimpered softly, its body curling into a tight ball as it trembled. Mrs. Etta's expression softened at the sight. "Poor thing, she murmured, crouching down beside Amara. Looks half-starved. I'll take care of him, Grandma, Amara said earnestly. I'll feed him, clean him up, and we can figure out what to do after that. Please. Her grandmother hesitated, glancing at the puppy, then at Amara's pleading eyes. With a resigned sigh, she straightened up. All right, but just for tonight. And you'd better hope nobody comes looking for him, or there'll be trouble. Thank you, Grandma. Amara beamed, her face lighting up despite the rainwater dripping from her braids. She grabbed another towel and began gently patting the puppy dry. Its tiny body quivered under her touch, but after a few moments, it began to relax. Amara spoke to it in a soothing tone as she worked. It's okay now, little guy. You're safe here. In the kitchen, she rummaged through the cabinets, finding a small bowl and pouring some milk into it. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. She placed the bowl in front of the puppy, who sniffed it hesitantly before lapping up the liquid with surprising enthusiasm. Mrs. Etta watched from the doorway, her arms crossed but a faint smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. You've got a way with creatures, Amara. Just don't get too attached, you hear me? This ain't our dog. Amara nodded, though her heart ached at the thought of letting the puppy go. I know, Grandma. But he's ours tonight, isn't he? Mrs. Etta shook her head, chuckling softly. Just tonight, she agreed, though both of them knew Amara's heart was already tethered to the little dog. As the storm continued to rage outside, the small apartment became a sanctuary of warmth and love. Amara laid a soft blanket near the heater and placed the puppy on it. He stretched out, his tiny body finally stilling as he drifted into a peaceful sleep. Amara sat beside him, stroking his damp fur gently. She didn't know who he belonged to or where he'd come from, but she couldn't shake the feeling that their paths had crossed for a reason. As she watched the rain streak down the window, a thought settled in her mind: no matter what trouble it might bring, she wouldn't abandon him. Not now. Not ever. The morning air was crisp and fresh, the storm from the night before having swept the streets clean. Sunlight spilled across the damp pavement, casting a golden glow over the neighborhood. Amara walked briskly, cradling the puppy in her arms, her heart light with hope. The puppy had eaten a little that morning and wagged his tail weakly, a sign of growing strength. But his eyes still looked tired, and Amara knew he needed proper care. That's why she had convinced her grandmother to let her take him to the small, run-down veterinary clinic a few blocks away. You just tell them the truth, Mrs. Etta had warned her as she tied her scarf. You found him, and you're trying to do the right thing. People got a way of twisting things and it comes to folks like us. Amara had nodded, her resolve firm. All she wanted was to help the little dog. The clinic was small but welcoming, its walls painted in cheerful yellows with faded posters of smiling pets. Amara stepped inside, greeted by the soft hum of a ceiling fan and the faint smell of antiseptic. Hi there, said the receptionist, a kind-looking woman with glasses perched on her nose. What can we do for you? I found this puppy, Amara said, holding him up gently. He's really tired and scared. I just want to make sure he's okay. The woman's face softened. Let's have the vet take a look. Amara sat in the waiting area, stroking the puppy's head as he lay curled in her lap. Other people came and went, their pets in tow, but she paid them little attention, until the door swung open and a man stepped in. He was tall, his sharp suit tailored to perfection, but his disheveled hair and frantic expression betrayed his otherwise polished appearance. It was Thomas Hargrove, though Amara didn't know that yet. His eyes scanned the room, desperate, until they landed on her lap. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. His gaze locked onto the puppy, and a flood of emotions crossed his face: relief, anger, and something else Amara couldn't quite place. That's him! Thomas exclaimed, his voice loud and filled with accusation. He strode toward Amara, his polished shoes clicking against the tiled floor. Amara instinctively hugged the puppy closer, startled by the man's intensity. "Excuse me," she said, her voice small. "That's my dog," Thomas said, pointing at the puppy. "You stole him." The words hit Amara like a slap. "I didn't steal him," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I found him last night, in the alley. He was all alone in the rain." Thomas's eyes narrowed, his tone sharp. "You expect me to believe that? A purebred puppy like him doesn't just end up in an alley. You probably saw him and decided to take him for yourself." The room fell silent. Other clients in the waiting area turned their heads, their expressions a mix of curiosity and judgment. Amara's cheeks burned under their stares. "I'm telling the truth," she insisted, standing her ground despite the knot of fear tightening in her stomach. "I couldn't leave him out there. He would have died." Thomas's face softened for a fleeting moment, but it was quickly replaced by a hardened glare. "That dog is mine," he said coldly. "You had no right to take him." Before Amara could respond, the receptionist intervened, her voice calm but firm. "Sir, please lower your voice. Let's sort this out properly." Thomas took a step back, his jaw tight. Amara looked down at the puppy, who had woken up and was staring at both of them with wide, innocent eyes. "I didn't steal him," she whispered, her voice breaking. But as she stood there, facing the accusing glare of the wealthy man and the murmurs of the watching crowd, Amara realized that the truth wasn't always enough. For some people, who you were mattered more than what you did. The receptionist's voice broke through the tension. "Let's take this conversation to the back office. We'll figure out who this puppy belongs to." As Amara followed them, clutching the puppy tightly, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the man's mistrust pressing down on her. All she had wanted to do was help, but now it seemed like that kindness might cost her more than she ever imagined. The commotion began as a ripple, a hushed murmur among the people in the waiting room, but it quickly swelled into a wave of whispers and pointed stares. Amara stood in the center of the growing storm, clutching the puppy to her chest, her small frame dwarfed by the towering figure of Thomas Hargrove. "She stole a dog," someone muttered, loud enough for Amara to hear. "I knew it," another voice chimed in. "They're always up to no good." Amara's chest tightened. The puppy whimpered softly, as though sensing her distress, but she held him closer, determined not to let her tears fall. She glanced around the room, hoping to find even one sympathetic face, but the crowd's expressions ranged from skepticism to outright disdain. Thomas, his face a mask of controlled anger, addressed the onlookers. "This puppy is mine. He's a purebred, and I've been searching for him all night. This girl had no right to take him. I didn't take him." Amara's voice cracked as she tried to defend herself. "I found him in the alley last night, under a trash can. He was cold and scared. I just wanted to help." But her words seemed to vanish into the air, drowned out by the crowd's growing hostility. "A likely story," someone sneered from the back. "Why didn't you call the owner, huh? You were probably hoping to keep him. Or sell him," another added with a cruel chuckle. Amara's hands trembled. "That's not true," she said, but her voice was barely audible now, swallowed by the wave of accusations. "You can't trust people like her," a woman whispered to her companion, not bothering to lower her voice. Tears pricked the corners of Amara's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She lifted her chin, trying to summon a courage she wasn't sure she had. "I was just trying to help," she said again, louder this time. Thomas hesitated for a moment, his gaze flickering to the puppy in her arms. For a brief second, something softer crossed his face, but it was quickly replaced by the icy determination that had fueled his accusations. "Good intentions don't give you the right to take what isn't yours," he said firmly, his voice resonating through the room. The receptionist, trying to diffuse the tension, stepped forward. "Everyone, please calm down. Let's give this situation some space to be resolved." But the damage was done. The crowd had already passed its judgment, and their words hung in the air like a fog, thick and suffocating. Amara felt the weight of their prejudice pressing down on her, heavier than any rainstorm she'd ever walked through. Her grandmother's warning echoed in her mind, people got a way of twisting things when it comes to folks like us. Amara hadn't understood the full meaning of those words until now. I just wanted to help him, she whispered again, her voice breaking as she looked down at the puppy. His innocent eyes gazed back up at her, oblivious to the turmoil around them. In that moment, Amara realized that no amount of truth would matter to these people. They saw her through a lens of prejudice, and her actions were irrelevant. She could have saved 100 puppies, but to them, she would still be guilty of something, anything, simply because of who she was. As the crowd continued to murmur and judge, Amara silently vowed to protect the puppy no matter what. She might have been alone in that room, but she wasn't about to give up. Not on herself, and certainly not on the little life she had saved. Amara sat on the worn couch in her grandmother's living room, the puppy nestled in her lap. His small body had finally stopped trembling, but Amara's heart hadn't. Her grandmother, Mrs. Etta, paced the floor, her face a mix of anger and worry, while Amara's older brother, Jamal, leaned against the wall, his arms crossed and jaw tight. "This is ridiculous," Jamal said, his voice low but laced with frustration. "How's a little girl saving a dog turn into her being accused of stealing?" "Because it's not about the dog," Mrs. Etta said sharply, pausing in her pacing. "It's about who's accusing her. That man's got money, power, and skin the world listens to. We don't." Amara looked down at the puppy, who let out a soft whine as if sensing the tension in the room. "I didn't do anything wrong," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "I just wanted to help him." Mrs. Etta stopped pacing and knelt in front of her granddaughter, placing a firm but gentle hand on her shoulder. "We know, baby. And we're gonna prove it. But you've gotta be strong, you hear me? They're not gonna make it easy." The next day, the fight for the truth began. Jamal went to the alley where Amara had found the puppy, knocking on doors and speaking to anyone who might have seen something. Most people shrugged him off, wary of getting involved in anything that might put them at odds with a man like Thomas Hargrove. But one elderly shopkeeper, Mr. Patel, hesitated when Jamal explained the situation. "I think I saw the dog last night," he said, stroking his beard thoughtfully. "Poor thing was running down the street, soaked to the bone. I didn't see who found him, though." Jamal thanked him, jotting down his statement. It wasn't much, but it was something. Meanwhile, Mrs. Etta reached out to the community center where Amara often volunteered. Several staff members vouched for her character, describing her as a kind and trustworthy girl who was always the first to help anyone in need. "She'd never steal anything," one of the workers said firmly. "If she found that dog, it's because she wanted to save it." Armed with these statements, Mrs. Etta and Jamal accompanied Amara to the local police station, where Thomas had already filed his complaint. The officer at the desk listened with a polite but distant expression as they explained their side of the story. "Do you have proof the dog was abandoned?" he asked, glancing at the papers Jamal handed him. Amara looked up, her eyes wide and pleading. "I didn't know I needed proof," she said softly. "I just didn't want him to die in the rain." The officer sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Look, I get it. You're a kid, and you probably didn't mean any harm. But Mr. Hargrove says that dog is his property, and until we can establish otherwise, that's how the law sees it." "It's not just about the dog," Mrs. Etta snapped, her voice shaking with anger. "You're choosing his word over hers because he's rich and we're not. If she were a little white girl, you'd be calling her a hero." The room fell silent. The officer cleared his throat but didn't meet her gaze. "We'll look into it," he said finally. But as they left the station, the sinking feeling in Amara's chest told her they wouldn't. That evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, the mood was somber. Amara pushed her food around her plate, barely eating. The puppy lay curled up in his makeshift bed, his small snores the only sound in the room. "We're not giving up," Jamal said suddenly, breaking the silence. "They might not believe us, but we've got the truth on our side. We'll make them see it, one way or another." Mrs. Etta nodded, though her face was weary. "The truth don't always win, son. But that don't mean we stop fighting for it." Amara looked up, her eyes shining with tears. "What if it's not enough?" she whispered. Her grandmother reached across the table and took her hand. "Then we keep fighting anyway. Because doing what's right ain't about winning, it's about standing tall, no matter what they throw at you." Amara nodded, a flicker of determination lighting in her chest. She wasn't just fighting for herself now. She was fighting for the puppy she had saved, for her family, and for the belief that kindness and truth still mattered in a world that often seemed to forget them. And no matter how much the odds were stacked against her, she wouldn't back down. Thomas Hargrove sat in his spacious study, the weight of the past few days pressing down on him like an iron shroud. The rain had long since stopped, but the storm it unleashed in his life was far from over. Stacks of papers cluttered his normally pristine desk, statements, police reports, and a growing file of emails and letters from the community, some in support of his accusations, but many calling his actions into question. In the center of it all was a single photograph. It showed Amara, her small frame hunched protectively over the puppy, shielding him from the rain. Her eyes, wide and full of innocence, stared straight into the camera lens. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He hadn't wanted to believe he could be wrong, but the evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. Over the past 2 days, the story had taken on a life of its own, spreading across the neighborhood like wildfire. Witnesses had come forward to confirm that a young girl had found the puppy, huddled in the rain, and brought him to safety. One name kept surfacing, Mr. Patel, the elderly shopkeeper. His detailed account of seeing the puppy wandering alone in the storm had been the final crack in the wall of certainty Thomas had built around himself. "She didn't steal him," Thomas murmured, the words feeling heavy in his mouth. "She saved him." He turned toward the window, his eyes tracing the sprawling gardens outside. The sunlight streaming through the glass felt mocking now, as if the world were continuing without care for the turmoil in his chest. The truth was undeniable, but it was more than that, it was the realization of what his actions had caused. He thought back to the clinic, the way the girl had clutched the puppy as though he were her lifeline. He'd seen the tears glistening in her eyes, heard the tremor in her voice as she insisted she had done nothing wrong. And yet, he had dismissed her. Worse, he had humiliated her. For Thomas, it was as though a mirror had been held up to his face, forcing him to confront a version of himself he didn't want to see. A man so blinded by fear of loss, so consumed by his own grief, that he had lashed out at the wrong person, an innocent child who had shown more compassion and bravery in one stormy night than he had in years. Later that evening, Thomas sat in the empty dining room, the untouched dinner on his plate growing cold. Max, the puppy, lay in his bed near the fireplace, occasionally glancing up at him with wide, trusting eyes. "You must have been so scared," Thomas said softly, his voice breaking. "And she was the one who kept you safe." The realization stung. Every moment of comfort Max had in that storm was because of Amara, not him. The image of her small hands, trembling as she held the puppy close, replayed in his mind. She had risked the cold, the rain, and even her safety for a creature that wasn't hers. And what had he done? He had turned her kindness into a crime. Thomas pushed his chair back abruptly, the scrape of wood against marble echoing through the room. He couldn't sit there any longer, drowning in guilt. He needed to act. The next morning, Thomas made his way to the modest apartment building where Amara lived. The contrast to his grand estate was striking, but it wasn't the peeling paint or creaking stairs that caught his attention, it was the sound of laughter spilling from an open window. Peering in, he saw Amara sitting cross-legged on the floor, Max wriggling happily in her lap. Her grandmother watched from a nearby chair, her expression a mix of warmth and worry. The sight stopped him in his tracks. It wasn't just a puppy she had saved, it was something deeper. She had given Max love when he had no one, and in return, he had brought a glimmer of joy to her small, uncertain world. Thomas swallowed hard, feeling a lump form in his throat. He raised a trembling hand and knocked on the door. When the door opened, Mrs. Etta stood before him, her sharp gaze scanning his face. She said nothing, waiting for him to speak. "I'm here to apologize," Thomas said, his voice low but steady. "I was wrong." He stepped inside, his heart pounding as he turned to face Amara. The girl looked up, her wide eyes a mixture of surprise and wariness. "I know the truth now," Thomas said, his voice softening. "You saved him. You saved Max when I couldn't. And I accused you of something terrible. I'm so sorry, Amara. I was wrong, and I'll do whatever it takes to make it right." For a moment, the room was silent. Then, Amara's grandmother spoke. "It takes a big man to admit he's wrong," she said carefully. "But words ain't enough. You've got some trust to rebuild." Thomas nodded, his throat tightening as he met Amara's gaze. "I hope you can forgive me," he said, his voice breaking. Amara looked down at Max, who licked her hand as if urging her on. She took a deep breath, her small shoulders straightening. "I forgive you," she said quietly. "But next time, listen. People like me deserve to be heard too." Thomas felt tears sting his eyes as he nodded. This was just the beginning, he knew, but it was a step towards something better, for all of them. The knock at the door was hesitant, almost uncertain, as though the person on the other side wasn't entirely sure they should be there. Amara and her grandmother exchanged a glance. It was late afternoon, and visitors weren't common in their small, quiet apartment. Mrs. Etta rose from her chair, her footsteps firm on the creaking floorboards. She opened the door to find Thomas Hargrove standing there, his tailored suit slightly rumpled, his expression a mixture of humility and resolve. "You again," she said, her voice guarded, though not unkind. "Yes," Thomas replied, his tone softer than she'd expected. He cleared his throat, shifting awkwardly. I came to apologize." Mrs. Etta studied him for a moment, her sharp eyes weighing his sincerity. Then she stepped aside, gesturing for him to enter. "Well, come on in, then. Let's hear it." Inside, Amara sat cross-legged on the floor, Max curled up beside her. The puppy's tail wagged lazily at the sight of Thomas, but Amara's face remained cautious, her eyes narrowing as she looked up at the man who had caused her so much pain. Thomas's gaze dropped to the floor for a moment before he crouched down to meet Amara at eye level. "Amara," he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion, "I owe you an apology. A real one." Amara didn't say anything, her hands instinctively moving to stroke Max's fur. Thomas took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "When I lost Max that night, I was terrified," he continued. "He's more than just a puppy to me, he's my family. After losing my wife and daughter, I didn't think I could ever care about anything again. And then Max came into my life." His voice faltered, but he pressed on. "When I thought he was gone, I panicked. I let that fear take over, and I lashed out at you. I didn't listen. I didn't think. And that was wrong." Amara's fingers stilled on Max's back. Her gaze softened slightly, but her lips remained pressed in a thin line. Thomas ran a hand through his hair, clearly struggling with the weight of his own words. "You didn't just save Max," he said, his voice quieter now. "You saved a part of me too. I can't undo what I said or how I treated you, but I need you to know how sorry I am. And I'll do whatever it takes to make it right." The room was silent for a long moment, the only sound the faint hum of the old refrigerator in the corner. Then Mrs. Etta spoke, her voice firm but fair. "Apologies are a start," she said, her arms crossed. But actions speak louder than words. What you did hurt my granddaughter. Hurt this family. You got a lot of work to do if you want to mend that. Thomas nodded, his expression earnest. I understand, he said. I don't expect forgiveness right away. I just hope. I hope we can start somewhere. Amara looked up at him then, her young face thoughtful but wary. You really love him, don't you? She asked, her voice soft. Thomas nodded. More than I can say. But I see now that you love him too. You cared for him when I wasn't there. And for that, I'll always be grateful. The honesty in his words seemed to touch something deep within Amara. She glanced down at Max, who had rolled onto his back, exposing his belly for a rub. A faint smile tugged at her lips. I forgive you, she said finally, her voice steady but quiet. But, you need to remember that just because someone doesn't look like you, or live like you, doesn't mean they're doing something wrong. Thomas's throat tightened at her words. He nodded solemnly. You're absolutely right, he said. And I'll never forget it. Mrs. Etta's expression softened as she watched her granddaughter. She placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder, her grip firm but not unkind. You've taken the first step, she said. Now let's see where it leads. Thomas stayed for a little while longer, talking with Amara and her grandmother, sharing stories about Max and the joy he had brought to his life. By the time he left, the tension in the room had eased, replaced by a tentative sense of understanding. As the door closed behind him, Amara looked down at Max, who gave a happy bark, as if sensing that something had shifted. She smiled, stroking his soft fur. It's a start, she said, more to herself than anyone else. And sometimes, that's enough. The sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky in warm hues of orange and pink as Amara sat on the small stoop outside her grandmother's apartment. Max lay at her feet, his golden fur gleaming in the soft light as he chewed on a toy. The air was quiet, save for the distant hum of the city and the occasional laughter of children playing a few buildings away. Amara's heart was heavy. She had replayed the events of the past few days over and over in her mind, the harsh words, the accusing stares, the unbearable weight of being seen as something she wasn't. She had done the right thing, but the world had twisted it into something ugly. Amara, her grandmother's voice broke the silence. Amara looked up to see Mrs. Etta standing in the doorway. Behind her was Thomas Hargrove, his posture uncertain, his face a mixture of humility and determination. He's back, Mrs. Etta said softly, her tone neutral. Amara hesitated, her fingers instinctively running through Max's soft fur. She didn't want to face him again, didn't want to relive the sting of his accusations. But then Max looked up at her with his wide, trusting eyes, and she felt a flicker of the same courage that had pushed her to rescue him that stormy night. She stood, brushing off her jeans, and gestured for Thomas to come closer. He approached slowly, stopping a few feet away. Amara, he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. I owe you more than just an apology. I owe you my gratitude, my respect, and an acknowledgement of how deeply I wronged you. She said nothing, her gaze steady as she listened. When I lost Max, I was consumed by fear, Thomas continued. I let that fear turn into anger, and I took it out on you. You were a child showing more courage and kindness than most adults could muster, and I let my own biases blind me to that. I was wrong. Amara's lips pressed into a thin line. She looked down at Max, who was wagging his tail, oblivious to the weight of the moment. Her fingers brushed over his fur as she let out a slow breath. You hurt me, she said finally, her voice quiet but firm. You didn't just accuse me, you made other people believe I was something I'm not. You made them think I was a thief. Thomas nodded, his expression pained. I know. And I'll carry that guilt for the rest of my life. I can't take back what I did, but I can promise to be better, to listen, to learn, and to never let something like this happen again. The sincerity in his voice was undeniable. Amara studied him for a long moment, the tension hanging heavy in the air. Then, with a small sigh, she spoke. "You were wrong," she said, her voice steady, her words clear. "But you love him, just like I did when I found him. I forgive you." Thomas's eyes widened, his breath hitching as if he hadn't expected those words. Even Mrs. Etta, who had been watching silently from the doorway, looked surprised. Amara crouched down to scoop Max into her arms, his tail wagging furiously as she hugged him close. "I forgive you," she repeated, her voice softer now. "Because everyone makes mistakes. But you need to remember, kindness doesn't have a color. It's something we all have inside us, if we choose to see it." Thomas swallowed hard, nodding as tears glistened in his eyes. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for teaching me that." Mrs. Etta stepped forward then, placing a hand on Amara's shoulder. "Takes a big heart to forgive after all she's been through," she said, her tone laced with both pride and caution. "You'd better make sure she never regrets it." "I will," Thomas vowed, his gaze flicking between Amara and Mrs. Etta. "I'll make it right, I promise." As he left, the tension that had lingered in the air seemed to lift, replaced by a quiet sense of peace. Amara sat back down on the stoop, Max curling up beside her. Her grandmother sat next to her, letting out a long sigh. "You've got a heart bigger than most, Amara," she said softly. Amara smiled faintly, stroking Max's fur. "I just did what I felt was right, Grandma. That's all." And as the sun dipped lower, casting a golden glow over the world, Amara felt something she hadn't in days, a sense of closure, and the hope that perhaps forgiveness could mend more than just words. It could mend hearts. The days that followed were unlike anything Amara had ever experienced. Where once her world felt small and constrained, it now seemed to expand with every passing moment. Thomas Hargrove kept his promise. True to his word, he began to mend the damage his actions had caused, not just with apologies but with genuine acts of kindness and support. The first change came in the form of a simple but heartfelt gesture. Thomas returned to Amara's home, this time carrying a large basket filled with supplies, dog food, blankets, toys, and even a leash embossed with Max's name. He handed it to Amara with a small, uncertain smile. "I wanted to make sure Max has everything he needs," he said. "He's lucky to have someone like you looking out for him." Amara grinned, her fingers brushing over the soft leather leash. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice warm with sincerity. But Thomas didn't stop there. Over the following weeks, he made frequent visits, each one another step toward rebuilding trust. He helped Mrs. Etta fix the broken railing on their stoop, brought groceries to fill their modest pantry, and even arranged for Jamal to meet with someone who could help him find a better job. At first, Amara's family was cautious, their wariness understandable after everything that had happened. But as time passed, they began to see that Thomas wasn't just trying to ease his guilt, he was trying to build something lasting. One sunny afternoon, Thomas invited Amara and her family to his estate. It was the first time Amara had ever seen a house so grand, with sprawling gardens that seemed to stretch on forever. Max bounded ahead of her, his tail wagging furiously as he explored the lush greenery. Thomas knelt beside Amara, pointing toward a small grove of trees at the edge of the property. "That's where I planted a tree for my daughter," he said softly. "I'd like to plant another one, with you. For Max. To remind us both of how kindness can grow even in the hardest of times." Amara's eyes lit up as she nodded eagerly. Together, they dug into the rich soil, planting a young sapling that stood tall against the sky. Word of their story began to spread, not just through the neighborhood but beyond. People talked about the little girl who saved a puppy and the wealthy man who had learned to see the world through her eyes. It wasn't long before reporters showed up, eager to capture the story of redemption and forgiveness. In one interview, Amara was asked how she found the strength to forgive. "It wasn't easy," she admitted, glancing at Max, who sat contentedly at her feet. But I knew holding on to anger wouldn't change anything. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting what happened, it means choosing to move forward. And sometimes, it means building bridges where there were none before. Her words resonated far beyond her small community, sparking conversations about empathy, understanding, and the power of reconciliation. One evening, as the sun set in brilliant hues of gold and crimson, Thomas and Amara sat on the same stoop where their journey of forgiveness had begun. Max lay sprawled between them, his head resting on Amara's lap. "Do you think people can really change?" Thomas asked, his voice thoughtful. Amara looked up at him, her young face wise beyond her years. "I think people can learn," she said simply. "And when they learn, they change." Thomas smiled, a deep sense of gratitude washing over him. "You've taught me more than you'll ever know, Amara. And you've shown me that people can surprise you," she replied with a grin. As they sat there, watching the first stars blink into existence, it was clear that the bond they had formed was more than just a truce, it was a bridge built on kindness, hope, and the belief that even in a world full of injustice, hearts could still be mended. What did you think about Amara's decision to forgive Thomas? Would you have done the same in her place? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story and believe in the power of kindness and forgiveness, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales. Your support helps us share stories that inspire change.